first thing they took was never the crown. It was always the silence. And you only begin to understand this when you look beyond the grand statues and heroic carvings that history left behind, and instead read the fragments that survived in margins and forgotten letters, where the ink fades as if trying to escape memory itself, because Rome did not merely conquer territory, it reshaped identity. And nowhere was that transformation more deliberate than in what happened to queens. Not during battles or dramatic confrontations, but afterward. During the quiet hours when the crowds dispersed and the spectacle ended and the real process began. A process so subtle that many observers never recognized it as conquest at all, because Rome understood something deeper than victory. It understood narrative. And if you could change how a person was remembered, you could erase what they once were without ever raising a weapon again. And so the journey toward Rome rarely began with chains or loud declarations. It began with movement, slow and deliberate travel that stretched across landscapes as if time itself had been recruited into the strategy. Convoys moved gradually, stopping often, allowing the captured ruler to feel the distance growing behind them. And at each stop, small details changed. New garments replacing old ones.
Behold,
Familiar
the ancient
servants
prophecy is
quietly
clear.
Its
reassigned.
wisdom must guide our path.
Translators
But the stars
rotating
suggest
so
otherwise.
language
Precisely.
itself felt unstable. Until the queen, who once commanded thousands, found herself surrounded by people who spoke politely, yet felt emotionally distant. And this isolation did not announce itself as punishment. Instead, it disguised itself as protocol, as hospitality, as cultural adjustment. But the effect was unmistakable. Identity began to loosen, not shattered, but softened. And by the time the walls of Rome appeared on the horizon, many had already experienced the first transformation. The realization that their story was no longer entirely theirs to control, because Rome itself was overwhelming by design, its sheer scale erasing individuality through magnitude alone. Streets filled with movement that never ceased. Columns rising like endless forests of stone. Voices overlapping in dozens of dialects until personal significance felt diluted. And for someone raised as the center of their own kingdom, the shift was immediate and disorienting. Here they were no longer singular, no longer the axis around which events revolved. They were one presence among countless others, and this was not accidental, but carefully constructed psychological architecture. Because the triumphal procession that followed was less about humiliation and more about redefinition. Crowds gathered not always to mock, but to observe, to witness, to absorb the story Rome presented. Captured royalty walking behind victorious generals in garments chosen to send subtle messages. Elegance without sovereignty. Dignity without authority. A visual language that communicated transformation more effectively than words ever could. And incense burned through the air. Petals scattered beneath footsteps. The atmosphere blending celebration with something quieter, something almost ceremonial. As if the queen was being introduced not as a defeated enemy, but as a character entering a new narrative written by Roman hands. And after the spectacle ended, came the phase few people truly understood. Because contrary to popular imagination, many queens were not locked away in darkness, but placed within villas filled with gardens and art and conversations that felt almost respectful. Luxury that functioned as a framework for assimilation rather than reward. Tutors introduced Roman philosophy, etiquette lessons reshaped posture and expression. Invitations to gatherings created opportunities for observation where senators asked questions that sounded curious but subtly reframed identity, turning complexity into fascination, turning sovereignty into exoticism. And slowly the queen became both guest and symbol, admired yet contained within a role, that could not expand beyond the boundaries Rome allowed. And this transformation did not require force because it relied on perception. Conversations guided interpretation. Translators adjusted nuance. Emotions were acknowledged but subtly redirected into narratives that reinforced Roman superiority, until even personal memories felt slightly distant, as though filtered through another culture's lens. And one fragment of writing survives from an unnamed queen who described it perfectly when she wrote that they did not silence her but translated her. A statement that captures the essence of Rome's approach, because translation reshapes meaning while preserving the illusion of voice. And so evenings passed in philosophical discussions, mornings in ceremonial visits, afternoons in gardens where freedom existed without power. A paradox that weighed heavier than confinement, because movement without influence felt like walking through a dream where nothing responded to your decisions. And some queens adapted, learning Latin with remarkable speed, mastering Roman social cues, hosting gatherings where scholars debated ideas under candlelight, their intelligence admired as long as it did not challenge the narrative Rome had assigned them, while others preserved fragments of identity through small, private rituals, whispered songs remembered from childhood, jewelry hidden beneath carefully chosen garments, gestures invisible to observers, but deeply significant to the person performing them. And rumors spread quietly among servants and visitors about queens who disappeared into marriages arranged by politics. Queens who entered religious roles where their presence symbolized unity between cultures. Queens whose names simply faded from records without explanation. Not erased through dramatic endings, but through gradual absence. And this ambiguity allowed history to reshape them endlessly, turning individuals into legends, warnings, or footnotes depending on who told the story, because Rome understood that ambiguity was more powerful than certainty. And somewhere within the archives, a philosopher is said to have written that defeating a ruler is temporary, but redefining them lasts forever. Whether he truly existed hardly matters because the idea itself reveals Rome's strategy, to transform identity so completely that resistance becomes indistinguishable from adaptation. And there came a moment described repeatedly, though never exactly the same, when a queen realized she had begun thinking in Roman terms, measuring time differently, interpreting architecture differently, laughing at humor she once would not have understood. And that realization frightened many, because it meant Rome was no longer outside them, but within their thoughts. And when visitors from their homeland arrived, the change became undeniable. Envoys unsure whether to bow as subjects or greet as equals. Conversations carrying a subtle distance that had never existed before. The queen standing between two identities without fully belonging to either. And perhaps that is why some later described Rome's methods as worse than death. Not because of cruelty, but because identity continued without resolution, suspended between past and present. A living contradiction shaped by forces too subtle to resist directly. Yet among these stories there exists one that differs from the rest. The story of a queen who anticipated this transformation long before she ever saw the gates of Rome. A queen who understood that Rome did not conquer bodies as much as it conquered narratives, and instead of preparing for battle, she prepared for the moment after victory, planning not how to escape chains, but how to survive translation itself. And what she did next would change how Rome remembered her forever.